What's up, guys? Welcome back. Today we're working on the engine rebuild of this 383 stroker. The last video we released, we tore this all down and we haven't touched it since. We got that stimmy check, which means we got a new crank and bearings. So we're gonna throw those in, show you guys how to measure the tolerances. That way we can send the crank off to the machine shop to get balanced. Our new crank is a cast crank. It's a Summit Racing brand and it was probably 180 bucks. We'll put a link down in the description. But let's get into it. So to get these old bearings out, we're just going to take a hammer and a screwdriver and give them a little tap to get them unseated, and then we should be able to pull them out. And we want to be careful not to scratch or score any of this, obviously. Okie doke, easy peasy. Lemon. Squeezy. Now we're gonna pop the old ones out of the main caps as well. And I should point out, what we're doing is hitting the side without the notch. That way that notch comes up and unseats. And these ones you can just take and press on that side and should pop right out. And again, we want to be very careful that we keep these in the same order and orientation as they are when we took them off the engine. And this big one's going to be a little bit trickier, so we're going to be very careful and just give it a little tap as well. Maybe. Ooh, this one's pretty cooked. So these bearings had probably under 2,000 miles, so they came out pretty easy. This one, if you take a look at it, we had the crank rubbing along this, which heated it up and grooved it up pretty good, which is probably why it's being a little bit of a pain. Oh, jeez, oh Pete's. Okay, easy. Now that we've got all of our old bearings out, we're going to prep this surface to put in our new bearings. So we just gave those a quick wipe down. We're going to do a deeper clean with a little bit of acetone. I think I've said it in videos before. If you're using brake cleaner, because it dries so quickly, sometimes moisture will gather as it evaporates. So acetone dries a little bit slower and is going to be better for this kind of thing. And we'll step over to the main caps and do those. Our main goal here is really just to make sure these are really nice and clean. That way there isn't oil or anything that throws off our measurements. Okie doke. So let's break out these bearings. And we're going to do the upper side first. And I know what you're thinking, isn't this the lower side? Well, the engine is upside down right now, so there's that for you. All right, and same deal, we're going to give these a quick wipe down as well. Make sure there's no grease or oil. And what we're going to do is line up this tab with the tab right here on the engine block. So we're just going to very carefully set that in, and just like how we took them out, so sometimes setting them off a little bit and then twisting them into place to where they're flush is going to be your best bet. And for these, there's a upper and lower side, so we want to make sure we have the bearings with the holes in them lining up with the holes in the oil galleys. So if we take a look at the lower bearings, you can see there's no hole. And same deal, we've got the groove on the bearing and on the cap. So we're going to line those up. And push it down into place just like so. So we want to line up the grooves on the same side. And we'll just slip that on like so. And again, we're keeping this in the same orientation. You can see this triangle points forward. That's how it has to go on. Now that we've got these bearings installed, we're going to torque down the caps. But because all of these bearings fit so snugly in the block, and I can actually show you this, if they fit really loosely, you can actually take a chisel and tap the block, and that's going to close up the gap that the main caps sit in. So if you take a look at these right here, you can see that we actually had to do that when we replaced the bearings the first time. So we're going to take a rubber mallet and just give them a tap or two and make sure they're seated all the way in there. So now we can put on our washers and our nuts, and we're going to torque these to spec. These are ARP studs, which are reusable, and they're a great quality product. I would highly recommend them. So we're going to get these all hand tight, and then we're going to torque them in a sequence 3 times. So we're going to start at about 30 foot-pounds, go up to 50, and then to our final torque. And our torque for those are going to be, for the inner bearings, 70 foot-pounds, and the outer 2 bearings are going to be 65 foot-pounds. And then we can take some measurements. Got our 11/16 torque wrench set to, what did I say, 30? And if we had the crank in here, we would want to torque them in sequence. Since we don't, it's not a huge deal how we do them. That way the crank doesn't get pinched or torqued in any strange ways. So the reason we're installing these before we install the crank is we're going to take a dial bore indicator, or you could use calipers, and we're just going to measure each of the bores to make sure the bearings are close. Then we're going to measure the journals of the crank and make sure it's looking pretty close, and then we're going to double check with Plastigauge. I should mention, Plastigauge is not for high performance applications, and you should measure with precision equipment anything that's not going to be like a daily driver. So now what we've done is made sure that this would be the final size of the bearings and main caps. Okay, I'm going to take a look at the crank here. So we can see that this is clearly covered in oil, so we're going to clean all that off before we measure anything. So now that we've cleaned all the journals on the crankshaft, what we're going to do is take a caliper and we're going to measure this. Okay, and we want to make sure we don't have, I guess if I zeroed it, that might be helpful. Okay, zero your caliper. So we're right at 2.446. 2.446, and we'll lock that down. Then we're going to set up our dial bore gauge. So how we set this up is this indicator measures off this post back here, and we only have a couple of thousandths of play, so we need to make sure we have the proper length probe here so that when we're measuring, it lands somewhere in that range. So what we're going to do now, so you're going to get that sandwiched in between your caliper, and then this is always a fun process. So I wish I had a tip for this on you guys, but I really don't.
Second person.
A second person, second extra set of hands. Set our indicator to 0. Okay, so we're good right there. And we'll lock that down. And now we're going to come over here, and this gauge is going to be a little upside down for y'all. So now that we've got our gauge in there, we're going to move it slightly up and down to where it's goes to the highest point and then goes back down. So right there, we're at about 2.5 thousandths, which is exactly what we want. So we'll run through the rest of these and make sure they're all good. So we measured all of these. It looks like we're just under 2 thousandths to a little over 2.5 thousandths. And really, we were doing that just to make sure we can test with the Plastigauge and double check everything. So let's go ahead and pull these off and we'll show you how to use the Plastigauge. All right, so we got all the nuts off. So to take these off, these aren't just gonna wobble off, so you just give them a little tap. Okay, and we're gonna set these in the same order they came off. Alrighty, so we're gonna give all these journals one last wipe down so we don't get any dust or debris or oil on the bearings for the Plastigauge. And again, this is a dry assembly, so we wanna be really careful that we don't rotate the crank inside the bearings so we don't scratch anything up, and we also don't want to push too hard on one side or another so it sits flat in there. So we're going to grab it from both ends and very carefully we're going to lower it into place. It's okay, perfect, very good. So this is a Plastigauge kit. It's super simple. Buy this with our Amazon link, we get money, so do with that information what you will. We're gonna use this green strip that measures from 1/1000 to 3/1000 of an inch. So we're gonna open this up and you can see that super thin green strip in there. Basically what that is a super small, thin piece of plastic. And when we smash that down in between the bearings and the journals of the crank, it's gonna smush out to one of these sizes. So what we're gonna do is cut off a little piece of that and then just set it on the crank just like that. Okay, so we've got those all in place. Now we're just very carefully gonna set on all the main caps. Alrighty guys, and then just like before, what we're gonna do, torque in 3 steps. We're gonna start at the middle and then work our way out. So that looks something like this. And I had these all hand tight, so just real quick, we're gonna tighten them all down, snug them up a little bit, and now we'll go for torque. So again, this is 30 foot-pounds. And we'll go to 50. And to our final torque, 70 on the inside. Down to 65. Okay, and now we can take them all off again. So we're just gonna loosen all these up. So you saw how it went in as a strip, and now that it's smashed down, we can kind of compare the size here. So the larger it is, the less tolerance there is. So we're looking at over 0.15 there. That's not ideal. We want a little bit closer to 2/1000 of an inch. And again, Plastigauge is not the most accurate way to do this, but it gives you a pretty good idea. This guy is a little bit harder to see, but it looks about the same. Yeah, a little bit less than, like not quite a thousandths, not quite a thousandths. Jesus Christ, what just happened? Not quite a thousand. So we're well over 2/1000 of an inch. So now that we have all those measurements, we're gonna let the machinist know exactly what we're at. We're gonna take the crank, pistons, rods, harmonic balancer, flex plate, all to get balanced. And then we'll be back here for the install. Right now, we're gonna get this crank back out, clean it up, and cover this block so nothing gets dirty. All right, so it's a new day. We got the crank back from the machine shop. It was a hefty bill. They ended up putting 1,200 grams of tungsten in. So you can see where they drilled out and pressed in the tungsten. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pieces that they had to add. When we got it back from the machine shop, they gave us this neat breakdown. So they've got initial spin and all the forces and weights they had for that, and then our final spin. So obviously you can see at these high RPMs, this crank was throwing around a lot of weight on both sides, and our final spins were way better. So that's what we can see there. And then they also gave us the bob weight card. So like we said before, we took all the rotating assembly, so crank, pistons, rods, balancer, flex plate, and they basically broke it all down here, and that's how they calculate everything they need to balance this. They also pressed this gear on the end, since we're using the same timing chain cover as before. Now that we've got this back in, our bearings are in, what we're gonna do is measure the backlash. So that's gonna be the play forward and back we have in the crankshaft. That's supposed to be 4 to 8 thousandths of an inch. So what we have is this nifty little tool. We're gonna clamp onto the block somewhere, and then we have our dial indicator, and then we can basically pull and push the crank and measure that distance. The thrust bearing, which is the bearing in the back here, is what decides how much play you have. So if we've got too little play, we'd have to lap that. If we had too much play, then we've got an issue. So to get this set up, we're just gonna pick a spot on the block and clamp it on right there. And then we'll set up our indicator on the crank, lock this in place. Okay. And make sure it's all the way either forward or back, and we'll zero our gauge. Something like that. There we go. Okay. And now if we pull our crank forward, 2, 3, looks like about 4 thousandths. So we should be right where we need to be, and that's all we had to check there. Now, we've already clearanced this block because we had a stroker crank in it before, but something you'd need to do if this is your first time installing it is rotate the crank around and look for any points where it might contact the block. So we had to remove material, especially for rods as well, like right here or right here. That divot's not originally there, but for the piston rods, I think it's the bolt heads, have to have a little bit more clearance right there because this is a larger crank. So you'll have to go through, look at everything there, and then you can move on to the next steps. When we did this originally, we used this die grinder. It's a DeWalt, it's a beast. This thing chews through metal, but you want to be careful not to gouge anything, or especially any of the
drill into water.
Yeah, you want to be careful. You don't want to go too deep anywhere and drill into the water jacket or scratch any of the bores or anything like that. So since our block is clearanced, all of our tolerances look good. We're going to do a final clean of the block, and then we can put it all together. So now we deep clean. So we're going to get our best bottle of dish soap, pressure wash this bad boy off, use some brushes, be really careful not to scratch any of the bores, and we'll be back. All right guys, so we just deep cleaned the block. It was clean enough to eat off of for sure. But now that we've dried and blown it off, if we don't work quick, everything's gonna start flash rusting, so you'll get a really thin layer of rust on everything. So what I've got is a spray bottle of WD-40, and we're just gonna give a quick coat to everything so it doesn't rust. and then we can wipe it down. And when we, okay, hold on. And when we're wiping down the cylinders or any internal engine components, we really want to use a lint-free towel. So single ply, the cheapest toilet paper you can find, is usually a good bet. Okay, we're doing one last wipe down on the crank. And here goes nothing. And this is the final assembly, and we really don't want anything grinding. Just gonna do a generous dollop or two of oil. Okay. And we'll make sure this gets seated just like so. Oh yeah. Okay, easy peasy. And then just like before, we're gonna torque these in 3 stages. So each time I'm gonna go through, torque them all to like 30-ish, make sure it still spins well. Then again to 50, make sure it spins well. And we keep working on that till they're all torqued. Ooh, like butter, as the kids say.
Oh, that expression.
Yeah. Okay, and now we're going to 50. Okay, so now that we've done our second stage, it's still looking real good. So now this time we're gonna test and make sure it spins after each bearing we do, just to make sure if we tighten one down, it doesn't get bound up or anything like that. So again, 70 for the inside, 65 for the outside. Made me nervous there a little bit. Looking good. Beautiful. Okay. All right, and then we're gonna check our backlash one more time to make sure that that top main bearing in the back there, the thrust bearing, is good as well. Zero that John out, and when we push back, pull forward, my mistake. We're right at 3 thousandths. So we want this to be between 2.4 and 7.6 thousandths. So we are in that range, it looks good. So we can take this off. And I think that's gonna wrap it for this video. Next step's gonna be cam, timing chain, pistons, rods. So we'll catch you on that next one. As always, guys, thanks for watching. If you like the video, like the video. If you want to subscribe for more, subscribe for more, and we'll catch you on the next one.